Desde el pabellón del Fondo de Cultura Económica de la Feria Internacional del Libro de Guadalajara y con la figura estelar del momento en el mundo editorial, continuamos estas conversaciones a fondo en el marco del 80 aniversario del Fondo de Cultura Económica. El personaje de hoy es el economista francés Thomas Piketty, con quien hablaremos de su libro El Capital en el siglo XXI, que el Fondo lanzó esta temporada para todo el mundo del libro en español. En nuestra anterior edición con el presidente Enrique Peña Nieto hablamos sobre las reformas estructurales alcanzadas en los primeros meses del actual gobierno y dijimos que sea que se esté a favor o en contra de unas o de otras reformas, todo apuntaba y apunta a que marcarán un antes y un después en la vida nacional. También este libro ha levantado los más encendidos elogios, como el del Premio Nobel de Economía, Paul Krugman, que lo propone como el libro de la década, al lado de cuestionamientos, algunos más serios que otros, pero a muy pocos les cabe duda de que este libro ha marcado ya un antes y un después en los estudios sobre concentración de la riqueza y desigualdad a escala planetaria. Fiel a su origen en la literatura económica, esta casa editorial adquirió los derechos de este libro en la Feria Internacional del Libro de Frankfurt, a pocos meses de su lanzamiento en francés, es decir, antes de su aparición en inglés y de que con ello se colocara en el centro del debate económico mundial. Hoy, el Fondo de Cultura Económica incorpora a los países de habla hispana a este trascendental debate con su versión en español del Capital en el siglo XXI. Con estas conversaciones a fondo, el Fondo quiere seguir reforzando su carácter de plataforma de debate para México e Hispanoamérica sobre los temas de mayor interés nacional y global, con la participación de destacados académicos y periodistas. Para esta conversación con Thomas Piketty, hoy nos acompañan en estricto orden alfabético Pascal Beltrán del Río, director editorial de Excelsior y conductor de titulares de La Noche de Excelsior TV y de la segunda emisión de Imagen Radio. Pascal ha sido 2 veces ganador del Premio Nacional de Periodismo. Rolando Cordera, profesor emérito de la Facultad de Economía de la UNAM, coordinador del Programa Universitario de Estudios del Desarrollo y articulista del diario La Jornada. Ricardo Rafael, con maestrías en el Instituto de Estudios Políticos de París y en la Escuela Nacional de Administración de Francia. Es un estudioso y activista contra toda forma de discriminación y coordina la maestría de periodismo del CIDE, así como conduce el galardonado programa Espiral del Canal 11 del Politécnico. También tenemos a Javier Tello, con estudios de Filosofía Política y Economía en Oxford y maestría en Ciencia Política en Colombia. Javier es también el co-conductor del programa de análisis político Es la hora de opinar en Foro TV. Muchas gracias a todos y muchas gracias a la Feria Internacional del Libro de Guadalajara por su apoyo para la grabación de este programa, así como al Sistema Público de Radiodifusión SPR por esta gran producción y a las televisoras públicas y privadas que retransmiten estas conversaciones a fondo del Fondo de Cultura Económica. I'd like to begin this program, Conversaciones a Fondo, or In-Depth Conversations, sponsored by Fondo de Cultura Económica, by telling you, Thomas, that we are extremely proud of being your only Spanish language publisher, as well as being your host in Mexico and the rest of Latin America, including Spain, by the way. For the presentations of your already celebrated book, The Capital in the 21st Century. Look, since the founding of the Fondo de Cultura Económica in 1934, 80 years ago, concerns about economic and social development and, of course, about inequality have been the original and main focus of our publishing policies. So along these lines, this house acquired the rights of this book, certainly because it suited such publishing lines, and of course, before you became so famous, and obviously before it was placed at the center of the economic debate worldwide, as well as a bestseller. And that's why we could afford it. And now we are very happy to push forward this debate in the Spanish-speaking world These in-depth conversations, our publishing house is poised to continue being a platform for performance of discussions and debate on the most important topics of interest, both domestically and globally. You have already met the other members of this panel, scholars and journalists, colleagues and friends. Thank you all again. So let's get down to business and talk about your book. In effect, it has drawn unprecedented attention around the world because it has raised serious concerns about the rising of inequality in several of the world's richest countries. Last week, Le Nouvel Observateur pointed out that by the end of this year, you will sold 1 million copies worldwide. And it's my hope that the Spanish version, as well as this book fair, will have contributed to that. In fact, your formula, let me tell you, your formula is R higher than G, is recovering more celebrity than the T-shirts of Che Guevara. Look, check it out. We have this T-shirt. This is yours.
Oh, thank you.
And by the way, just here in Mexico, we are now launching the first reprint, I told you yesterday, of the book within the first 10 days of the first edition. You can check it out too. Look at this. Check it out. I think your comments on this phenomenon, the Piketty phenomenon, and the relevance of this Piketty's book for Mexico can be the launching pad to begin these in-depth conversations. Thomas, welcome.
Thank you. So let me first, apologize that my English sounds a lot like French, but I hope it will be okay. Let me also thank Fondo for publishing my book in the Spanish language. I was told that the translation was very beautiful, and I'm afraid my Spanish is not good enough to judge, but it's very important for me that my book is now available in the Spanish language and all across Latin America, and I'm very, very happy to have you as my publisher. So I was very glad with the success of the book in Europe, in North America, but of course, Latin America is a place where inequality has always been a very serious issue, and I care a lot about the debate in Latin America, and I'm very glad that the book is now available here. I think one of the reasons for the success of the book, first I think this is a readable book, an accessible book. I have tried hard to make it accessible to everybody. So this is an history of wealth, but this is mostly an history of the social groups that are behind the different levels of income and wealth. And so this is not a technical issue. And I think the success of the book shows that there are many people who don't want to leave these issues to others, to economists, and they want to make their own opinion. And there is a big demand for democratization of economic knowledge in a way, which I think the success of this book illustrates. So I'm very happy when I meet readers everywhere, including yesterday in the opening of the fair at Guadalajara. I see sort of normal people who tell me that they usually don't read that kind of big academic book, and who tell me that they could understand everything and that they learned a lot until the end. And this makes me very, very happy.
Well, thank you. You have some comment about Piketty in Mexico?
The phenomenon? Or,
yes.
Yeah. I mean, I would say there's a famous phrase, as you know, that from some Greek poet, that the fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. And I think this is that kind of a book. It's a book about one big thing that is always attractive. It also happens to be right, I think. So it's one big thing that also happens to tell the truth. But I think any book that helps explain past, present, and future is invariably attractive, and I think part of the phenomenon has to do with that.
It's more like a fox book than a hedgehog, I would say. I mean, it faces a lot of hedgehogs. It was said about John Rawls that after he wrote Justice as Fairness, it was impossible to talk about philosophy without quoting Rawls. And I would say that this is exactly what is going on with your book. After Capital at the 21st century, it would be very difficult to talk about economics without quoting you. Congratulations for that. It's not a book on economics. It's more a book on history of economics. And it's a book with a very strong philosophical discussion about democracy and inequality. This is what I would say is not, it's more like a fox book than a hedgehog. I don't know if that makes sense to you.
Yeah, I think I want to view my work more as a work of social science and a work of economics, of history. But probably if I have to choose a field, probably it's more a work of history than economics. This issue of income and wealth distribution, of course, was at the center of economics already a long time ago in the 19th century. Malthus, Ricardo, Marx were putting the issue of distribution at the center of their analysis, but they had very little historical data. So they had sometimes some good intuition about what was going on around them, and sometimes the intuition was not enough. And in the 20th century, Kuznets, Atkinson, and other people started to collect historical data, and I'm really following their sidestep. And I'm probably, in a way, I'm trying to mix this tradition of research on historical evolution of income and wealth with a tradition that we have in social and economic history. For instance, in France with Braudel or Simian or Labrousse, looking at the history of wages and wealth. And so I'm trying to show that we need to reconcile these different approaches, and we need to put the study of capital and inequality into this historical perspective. And so, yes, to me, it's more a book about the history of income and wealth. There's a little bit of economics also, but I think...
And some very elegant formulas.
Thank you. I think simple economics...
The reception in the US was the first one, was the launching pad for the book and for you. I remember, this reunion at the CUNY in New York with the Krugman and the rest of the gang, etc. Why was it? How do you explain this sort of enthusiasm regarding a book on concentration? Is it because, as Marx probably would say, it is because the US is the most advanced country also in terms of concentration and inequality, and then something is happening at the grassroots level regarding the question, or how do you explain this sort of fantastic reception by the academy, but the general public, I would say?
Yeah, I think you're right that part of the explanation is that rising inequality in the United States of America has been particularly large and, in fact, really enormous over the past few decades. So, it's not a coincidence if Occupy Wall Street happened in Wall Street rather than in Brussels or in Tokyo. Or, the rise of the top 1% income in large corporations, in the financial sector, happened in North America even more than everywhere else in the world. And indeed, between 1980 and 2010, over 2/3 of aggregate economic growth in terms of primary labor and capital income was taken by the top 10% and most of it by the top 1%. So this has become an issue of real macroeconomic significance. And there is a fear in the US that this leads not only to a stagnation of median incomes, a rise of household debt, that this contributed to make the financial system more fragile, and this contributed to the financial crisis. But there is also a fear that this is a threat for the democratic institutions themselves. And the power of private money in US politics was illustrated in the recent midterm elections. And this is something which in Europe is much less present for the time being. So I think my book resonates a lot with this concern, and probably this explains to a large extent the success of the book. Also, the fact that you have this tradition of liberal economists, well, liberal in the US sense, like Stiglitz, Krugman, of course, but also Bob Solow wrote, very, detailed and positive review of my book, which made me very happy because I have a lot of admiration.
I really enjoyed his review. One of the best ones.
He read very carefully. He has a very, it's not that he agrees about everything, but he read very, very carefully, which is something that economists don't always do, to put it this way. Economists often don't write books, or except textbook, and often they don't read book either. And I think it's a problem because, I think academic articles are useful, and I do that as well. But, I think writing books, which historians, sociologists, anthropologists are still doing, it's useful if you want to take big questions. You cannot do it in a small academic technical article. But I was very happy to see that Bob Solow, although he's much older than some younger people who don't read long books, read it very carefully.
I would say that probably one of the best features of the book is the controversy and the discussion it has generated. And by the way, congratulations to Fondo for the shrewdness of publishing this book. So I would like to jump directly into that. Even though inequality is on the rise in the US and Europe, many emerging countries such as Mexico are catching up with the developed world, and they are also bringing hundreds of millions of people into the middle class. How do you judge this paradox?
Well, I try to make clear in my book that there are powerful forces in the world distribution of income and wealth going in different directions. So, it's not a pessimistic book saying that inequality has to rise everywhere in all time period in every country. There are powerful forces that can also lead to a reduction in inequality. In particular, the diffusion of skills and knowledge and education can lead to a reduction of inequality. And that's part of the reason why emerging countries are growing faster than rich countries, which to some extent lead to a reduction of the inequality in the world distribution of income. And that's very positive. And this can also work within countries if you have educational institutions that are sufficiently inclusive and that allow large groups in the population to access the right skills and the right job. And now, the problem is that right now, even in emerging countries, you don't always have, these powerful, inclusive forces that allow a large group of the population to benefit from growth in a balanced manner. And also, you have very often a lack of transparency about income and wealth dynamics, which is a problem because it's very difficult to regulate the inequality of income and wealth in a peaceful, democratic manner if you don't have proper information and transparency about what's going on. And in China, it's a country where you have an income tax, but this is the only country in the world where you don't have any income tax statistics. So you don't know anything about how the number of taxpayers by income brackets is changing. So the Chinese government says that they want to fight corruption, but the way they do it looks a lot like in Russia, where you tolerate very wealthy oligarchs as long as they don't do politics, and then suddenly you put one or two in jail, which is probably not a very efficient way to regulate inequality accumulation, distribution
That's
of wealth.
the case of Mexico. That's
Okay.
the case of Mexico. Part of the fiscal culture of our country is that of the lack of transparency as a policy. We have been asking government in these weeks to give us whole information regarding the income brackets and the way they pay their income taxes, etc. And they, for instance, I signed a letter with a lot of colleagues, and they don't even answer those.
No, you are perfectly right, and this is actually the reason why Mexico and other Latin American countries are not present in the book as much as I would like them to be present. And I apologize about this, but this is not entirely my fault. This is because of difficulties to access to historical fiscal data and even to current fiscal data. Mexico is a country where the income tax was created a long time ago, I guess in 1925, as you told me. So it was even 10 years before the foundation of Fondo, so this is a long time ago. And this is about the time where the income tax was created in many countries. In France, it was 1914, in the United States of America in 1913, but Mexico was more or less in the same time range, except that we could never find the tax data and the tax tabulations that come with it. It could be sitting somewhere. For the recent period, we've been asking many times, and you have been asking many times with other scholars in Mexico to access the data, but so far, the government, whatever the political party in charge, has not been, very transparent with respect to this. And I think this is a problem because recent fiscal data that was made available in Brazil shows that, even in a country when the income tax system is maybe not working as well as it should, the inequality level that you can measure with the income tax data is still, a lot higher and probably a lot more realistic than what you have with the household survey data, which is based on self-reported information. And this is the kind of data that we've been using in Mexico or Brazil until now to measure inequality. And probably this is underestimating top income and top wealth level and underestimating inequality substantially. And in the case of Brazil, a recent study showed that the moving from household to fiscal data for the recent period completely changes the conclusion. So Brazil moves from a bit less unequal to the US to substantially more unequal, and the trend, instead of going down regarding inequality, is going up in the recent 10 years. So, I don't know about Mexico yet because we could not access the data, but, I very much hope in the near future, I would be very happy to be able to include Mexico in the World Top Income Database and to have a better basis for assessing how the different social groups are benefiting from growth.
Thomas,
I'm sorry.
you said in your book that in the future, we're going to see more inequality inside nations than between nations. And this is exactly what we are looking in Mexico now. At the same time, you said that bigger growth rates can be explained because one country is catching up another one in technology, in knowledge. But it looks like Mexico had big growth rates during the 60s and 70s, maybe because part of the Mexico was catching up. But there is another part of Mexico that is not catching up. Would you say that Mexico, like Turkey and other countries, are in the middle of this situation? I mean, part of the country catching up and the other part behind? And how, according to your book, could be, should be policy regarding this argument?
Okay, first of all, I don't know enough about Mexico, to give lessons about what the country should do, and so I can try to put into a sort of broad international and historical perspective the case of Mexico, but I don't know enough. I think, generally speaking, and probably this applies to Mexico as well, the most powerful force to reduce inequality and also to promote growth is very inclusive investment in education and very inclusive social investment, generally speaking. And so, having a well-funded educational system and social institution, is probably the most important way to to get rich. This requires sometimes a pretty big government, but also a pretty efficient government as well. So that's the difficult part, is to build a trust in government that can collect resources and invest them in the right direction. So if you take the case of Europe, the European Union, you have very different size of government. So the richer countries happen to have the bigger government. Sweden and Denmark have 40% or 50% of GDP in tax revenue, and they are much richer economies than Bulgaria or Romania, who have 20% of GDP in tax revenue.
This is exactly the Mexican one.
So this is Mexico. So I get Mexico would prefer to look like Sweden in terms of development than Romania and Bulgaria. And indeed, what this comparison shows is that, if it was enough to have low tax to become rich, Bulgaria and Romania would be richer than Sweden and Denmark. So now the reason why it's working in Sweden and Denmark is, of course, that the government is quite efficient at organizing both the tax system and the public services that go with this tax system. So, a big government can be the best or the worst of all things. It depends how it is organized and how we spend the money. So, in France, sometimes, the government is not as efficient as in Sweden and Denmark, and we have to learn from some of these countries. There's no perfect model to learn with, but I think we should not be afraid of investing more resources into educational institutions and health system. If we don't pay our teachers well, if we don't pay our nurses well, then the basic public services will not work. And if Mexico wants to grow in the 21st century, this requires, I think, this kind of very inclusive social investment, together with a tax system which people can trust. And I think if we want the middle class and the poor to accept to pay for these public services, you need to convince them that the rich people pay at least as much as they do. And if the middle class feels that they are paying less than the very wealthy, at some point the fiscal consent and the trust in government will just not work. So I think that's why more transparency about income and wealth taxation, and publishing information each year about how the number of taxpayers by income brackets, including for very high incomes, is changing in Mexico, including at the local level. That could be a way in some cases also to realize that maybe the income tax system is not working as well as it should, and this can also be a way to fight corruption. I think income taxation is important. I think wealth and property taxation can also be important. So Mexico is a country, from what I understand, where you have a lot of indirect tax, very high consumption tax, but there is no tax anymore at all on inherited wealth. So there was a tax on inheritance that was created in the 1920s at the same time as the income tax, but it was repealed in the 1960s. And so now it's 0%. So everybody in Mexico pays a large tax when you go to do your shopping or when you pay your electricity bill. But then if you receive millions or dozens of millions in pesos from your family wealth, you pay 0% tax, which is I'm not saying it should be 100, but probably you should pay a bit more than when you just pay your electricity bill. And so I think it's important to build a tax system that is more transparent, more progressive, if we want the trust in government to build up and the population to accept to finance better funded public services, which are key to development.
You know well Mexico.
Your book has been a great success in the U.S. So how do you explain that in the midterm elections, the Republicans won by a landslide? And this is the party that has watered down the taxes on the very rich. And let me add what has happened in Europe as a reaction to austerity, people voting for extreme right parties, xenophobic parties. How do you explain these?
Oh, okay. Well, I believe in the power of books, and the power of ideas, but I am not so naive that a book is going to reverse U.S. or European election. I think the impact of book has to be a long-term impact, and it is together with many other books, and that's democratic discussion. Everybody can influence the formation dominant opinion, but this takes a very long time. So right now, I think there are powerful forces in US and Europe that explain the trends that you mentioned, which are indeed very worrisome. So I think in the US, many people believe that inequality has become so large that in a way the very high income and wealth group have captured the political process, and the power of private money into politics has become very troublesome. What's particularly troublesome is that the Supreme Court in the US has decided to prevent the Congress at the federal level, but also at the state level, to pass any legislation limiting the power of private money into politics. So basically, judges nominated under Bush decided that there should be no limit to private money into politics, and this is very worrisome. And I think this is something we should look at carefully in every other country. The judges sometimes, of course, are very useful, but the power of Supreme Court in some case can be a limitation to the sort of democratic ability to design good laws to have a limitation on private money into politics. In Europe, we have different problems to solve. I think in Europe, there is indeed an evolution in direction of extreme right-wing vote and populist vote more generally that is extremely troubling, particularly in my country, in France, but also in other countries. I think the European Union is not working well, and the Eurozone in particular is not working well because a single currency with 18 different public debt, 18 different interest rates, 18 different tax systems in competition with one another is a system that doesn't work and that will never work. So, I think we need a much closer democratic and political union of European countries, or at least a smaller number of European countries to begin with, so as to convince public opinion that this can work for them and globalization can work for them and more integration in Europe can work for them. Otherwise, there is a serious risk that bigger and bigger segments of the public opinion will turn for a nationalist solution, and this is extremely worrying right now.
Somewhere you say that if this fundamental law of capitalism goes on by yourself, we might face a revolution. But what kind of a revolution are you envisioning in this world, and with this kind of cultural and even political progress the world has witnessed in the last century, let's say? But what were you thinking about?
Okay, let me first say that my book is not a pessimistic book. I can see that some people have an apocalyptic reading of my book, sometimes, but this makes me very sad because, in fact, I view my book as more optimistic. So, I don't think there's any fundamental law that has to lead to more and more inequality. I don't believe in deterministic economic laws. There are powerful economic forces pushing in different direction, and ultimately, my main conclusion is that, in a way, both Marx and Kuznets were wrong. Marx predicted ever rising inequality. Kuznets, at least in the Kuznets curve interpretation of his findings, believed in natural decline in inequality in advanced stages of development. And I believe both were wrong. That it all depends on the institution and policies that we choose. So I think there are policies in the fiscal area, in the educational area that can make market forces and globalization in the interest of everyone, and that can bring balanced growth. Now, if this does not happen, there will be reaction. So there are different kinds of revolution and political reaction, as you know, and nationalist reaction. I think is the biggest threat.
What would be the role of your social state you are suggesting?
Yeah, well, I
because
think
we have had, not in Mexico, but in Europe, you have had social state, let's call it, since the 1940s. Now it's under attack, but it still exists. What?
Exactly. No, it's under attack, but it's still there. And I think we should, feel that right now in European countries, I'm certainly not saying that we are back to the level of inequality that we had 1 century ago. I think we are in a much more egalitarian situation, partly because we still have a social state and social institution and public institution. Educational systems that are still working. But what I am saying is that these institutions are more fragile than we sometimes believe. They are more fragile because in the global economy, there's a real danger that small countries and each European country is becoming more and more like a small country. France and Germany pretend to be bigger than Belgium or Ireland, but in fact they will soon be as small as every other country as compared to the size of the world economy. And the competition between them to attract investment, to attract high wealth and high skilled workers, can lead to a pressure on the financing of our social state, which ultimately will fragilize this institution a lot. So that's why we need to be, we should not take for granted this social institution and be very careful about their long-run evolution.
Let me make a brief pause before we continue with these in-depth conversations. We will be back in a couple of minutes, please. We are back in these in-depth conversations with Thomas Piketty, with his book, and this book has frequently been praised because it is not a book on economics, but it deals with history, society, and even literature. And Piketty have abounded with arguments on how important history is to get a deeper understanding of the economy. However, I guess your book also underlines the role of literature to illustrate the realities that the cold statistical data fail to show. Some time ago, we had the Grand Gatsby curve, you remember. Prior to that, we had the references of Engels and Marx to Balzac and other writers. You have now added the Rastignac dilemma of Papa Goriot, and in an article published this week in the French daily Libération, talking about the effects of wealth concentration, you added the characters of La Voluntad y La Fortuna by Carlos Fuentes, along with personalities who are based on the real life, but who seem to be fictional characters, like Mr. Carlos Slim. But you have some issue with the Jane Austen.
Jane Austen. That is right. I'm not an economist, but I'm a huge fan of Jane Austen, which might be the reason I'm here. And even though you use Jane Austen to make a few points, and I'd like to do the same, if I may, and to point out to 3 differences between the Jane Austen universe and today. The first one is that Mr. Darcy, hero of Pride and Prejudice, Mr. Darcy is no Gordon Gekko. I would say that money back then was a means to an end. Today, it is an end in itself. I'm not suggesting that we should go back to the Jane Austen universe, but I am suggesting that maybe the way you fight a Mr. Darcy would be very different than the way you would fight a Mr. Gekko. That would be the first point, that money is now an end in itself. Before, you needed money to live like a gentleman, but money didn't make you the gentleman. My second point would be one of dominance of money. You point out that in the Jane Austen world, there was great inequality, and today there is great inequality. But I would argue that today we also have a problem of dominance. You can buy more with money today than back then, i.e. it is more relevant to good, it is more dominant to good. So we not only have a problem of inequality that you would solve through redistribution, but you also have a problem of dominance, which you need to solve, I guess, by putting limits, maybe moral limits, to what money can buy. And then my third point would be, has to do with merit and meritocracy. There was no merit to having money in the Jane Austen world. Nobody who had money had deserved that money. You were lucky if you inherited it. You were lucky if you fell in love with the right person and married for money. But there was no merit to having money. But today, people with money certainly, and even people without money, but certainly people with money, think they deserve the money they have. And I would suggest that precisely the problem we have is that the rise of the meritocracy, to use the title of the book of the guy who invented the concept of meritocracy, was invented precisely to point out that merit disguises injustice in a way that justifies it through merit. So it seems to me that another key difference between the Jane Austen universe and today is precisely that now we justify that inequality because we claim it is a result of merit. But it seems to me that merit is just as accidental as aristocracy and inheritance was.
You're perfectly right. This is what I call in the book at some point meritocratic extremism, you know, this kind of extremist discourse that tries to justify modern inequality in terms of merit, even in cases where it is not clear that it has much to do with merit or performance. And at least, you're right, at the time of Jane Austen, you know, nobody was trying to pretend that the servants were, you know, had less virtue or less merits than the masters. It just happened to be servants and to have no wealth, and the master happened to have wealth. And whereas today, you know, we are trying to justify, you know, the same extreme level of inequality on the basis of merit, and in a way that's putting even more pressures on the losers of the system than what that we used to. But, you know, I think at the same time we should certainly not idealize, you know, the inequality structure of the past, which was also full of dominance, and you know, some of the characters of Jane Austen made their fortunes through slavery, you know, investment in the West Indies. So, you know, this was a kind of property relation, you know, when you own another part of the population or another part of the human being, you know, which is arguably quite violent. And so, generally speaking, I think the literature has a unique powerful way, you know, to express the consequence of inequality for the life of people. So in Balzac, in Jane Austen, or, you know, in Carlos Fuentes, you have this incredible, powerful way to express what it means in the life of individual groups to have this unequal situation in terms of money. You know, I don't have, you know, that kind of talent. You know, I think social sciences, you know, can bring a different kind of language and a different kind of perspective on inequality, which I think is complementary to what the literature can bring. And when there's no possibility of a literary representation of inequality, I think it's a big limitation to our ability to understand inequality. So this is why in the book I try to confront the two. So is inequality today more violent than in the past? Yeah, in some way it is, and in a way, you know, this is the point I was trying to make comparing Carlos Fuentes to Balzac, where you know, you have the same issue of inheritance and, you know, how to get hold of a big pile of wealth. And, you know, at the end of the novel of Carlos Fuentes, you have an assassination by this young, ambitious woman who wants to get the money, basically the inherited wealth of the billionaire, who looks a lot like Carlos Slim. In Balzac, 200 years before, you know, this is exactly what Vautrin is proposing to Rastignac, except that Rastignac does not do it, and he feels that, you know, this assassination is a bit too much, and he's very tempted that, you know, at the end of the day, he prefers to find other means to become rich. So, you know, in a way, you know, the violence, you know, maybe in Mexico today is even more than in Paris in 1820 with regard to the inequality structure, or at least this is what Carlos Fuentes expresses as compared to Balzac. So, yeah, I think there's a lot to learn from the literature, including for economists.
Mr. Piketty, a moment ago you said this is an optimistic book. And maybe the most optimistic sentence or statement in your book is the one that I'm going to quote now. You said, forces leading to convergence, that is the opposite of inequality in your book, are diffusion of knowledge and investment on training. It's very interesting. It's very different from what Marx said or many others. But some pages after that, you said, education has not proven useful for real social mobility. Well, let me just with training, not with education. So I would like you to expand this vision of knowledge and diffusion of knowledge and distinguish between education and training. And I ask you to see Mexico. We have a big demographic bonus now. And we don't have a lot of time to make this demographic bonus to work in favor of Mexican economy.
So what I mean here in the book is that the big sort of educational promise of mobility, is not always fulfilled. And I think partly because sometimes there's a lot of hypocrisy in every society about meritocracy, and the elites or the winner, like to say that the system, and in particular the educational system, is meritocratic, but sometimes they do not really pay much attention to the measurement of whether it is meritocratic or not. So I give in the book the extreme example of the Harvard University in the US, where the average income of the parents of Harvard undergrad students corresponds currently to the average income of the top 2% of the US population. So this doesn't mean that nobody from below the top 2 gets into Harvard, but it means that the people who get into Harvard from below the top 2 are sufficiently few, and the people who are from the top 2 are sufficiently high in the top 2% that the overall average, if you take all students, is as if they had all been picked at random within the top 2% of the US distribution, which is a bit frightening if you compare this to the official meritocratic discourse based on the mobility of US society. Sometimes the admission has to do with the gift you make to the university. And, there's a lack of transparency. It's very difficult to access this kind of data, in spite of all the meritocratic discourse. And, other countries, don't always do better. I should say, in France, you don't have this very high tuition to enter universities. It's supposed to be public and meritocratic, but in practice, there's often a lot of hypocrisy as well. And, sometimes we invest, 3 times more public resources for students who come from more privileged social backgrounds and who happen to go in the more elitist schools than we invest in the students from more, average background who go to the normal university system. So I think we need to put these educational spendings under public scrutiny, and I'm sure in Mexico I know less well, but I'm sure sometimes there's also a lot of hypocrisy in sort of how much we spend for different social groups, and this is certainly a big issue for Mexico with the new generation and new very large generation.
You would say that training should be important, and maybe more important than education.
Well, education is a big part of training, but of course training goes beyond education, and I think just to conclude with a more optimistic note, I was very impressed yesterday at the opening of the fair in Guadalajara to see so many young people entering the fair and buying books. I can tell you I've been to other book fairs in Frankfurt and Paris, and the people were not as young, and maybe that's partly because the young generation are less numerous in Germany and France, but I think also, maybe there's less of an appetite for reading than we seem to have here, so that's element for optimism.
What is your take on the discussion regarding increasing substantially the minimum wage, as has been proposed by President Obama or by the mayor of Mexico City? And couldn't you achieve as much through increasing minimum wage than through the wealth tax you propose?
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think all these solutions, all these policy tools are complementary to one another. So, we need good education policy, we need good labor market policy, including minimum wage, and we need a good tax policy, including progressive taxation of income and wealth. And we don't have to choose between education, minimum wage, progressive taxation. We need each of these 3 pillars is important. I think regarding the increase in the minimum wage, of course, it all depends on where you start from and what's the initial level. So, I don't know enough about the level of the minimum wage in Mexico City. In the US, there's certainly a lot of scope for raising the minimum wage. And I think Obama was right to propose to increase it. It's important to realize that the purchasing power of the minimum wage, of the federal minimum wage right now in the US, is less than what it was in the 1960s, which is quite unusual for a country, in a 50-year period to have a decline in the real value of the minimum wage. And the unemployment rate in the 60s was not higher than what it is today. So it's very strange, and I think there is room for increasing the federal minimum wage in the US. Of course, you cannot ask everything for a minimum wage, and it's easier to increase the minimum wage even more if at the same time you invest in skills and education, and so that people can access high productivity jobs and high paying jobs. If you just increase the minimum wage without investing in skills, at some point, of course, there will be you will have a problem. So I think in the case of the US, increasing the minimum wage and more investment in the basic high schools and basic community college in the US are not so good. So you have very good top universities, but the bottom half of the population does not have access to very good skills. And I think that's part of the explanation for the very large rise in inequality in the US in the recent decades. And the solution involves more public investment in education and higher minimum wage at the same time.
One more thing, denying the meritocracy in Mexico. Ricardo Rafael not only read your book this past summer, I remember, but he also make his students to read it too. And this exercise inspired, in part, this recent book, Mi Reinato, which is as a metaphor of the kingdom of the rich kids, or
Spoiled kids.
the heirs of the affluent, of course. And by the way,
The non-taxable heirs.
not taxable. but perhaps we can prove here that social relations in Mexico are becoming more and more increasingly patrimonial and oftentimes corrupt. Isn't it, Ricardo?
Yeah, this is a book where I try to explain Piketty aux enfants for the kids, for the kids, for
Piketty
kids,
for dummies.
for dummies. No, but no, you're right. I mean, you said at the beginning of your book that usually the history of inequality is better explained by politics than by economics, by institutions.
That's right.
And in Mexico, we have institutions that are corrupt, where the rule of law doesn't work, where discrimination, not just inequality, discrimination is very strong. And these informal
By the way,
institutions...
we don't have women here.
We don't have women. We didn't invite women. We are talking about inequality, we didn't invite women.
That's why we are talking about inequality.
That's a
So
good
next time, thank you.
Thank you. We will correct it.
So what I was saying, I mean, all these informal institutions create inequality. And maybe you need more politics than economics to fight inequality.
You have to reinvent democracy, you wrote. Capitalism and democracy have to be reinvented. That's a very good point, very difficult one.
This is difficult, but I think democratic institutions can be stronger and they can win. And I think it's possible to reconstruct democratic institutions and democratic policies in order to take control of powerful capitalist forces and private property, which can be put in the common interest. I believe in private property capitalist forces, but I think we need democratic institutions to be stronger and to sort of take control of these powerful forces, put them in the right direction. That's difficult, but this is the only way you have, because if you don't trust democracy and you cannot be if you are skeptical both about the markets and about democracies, and what do you have? So we need to trust more democracies, and this is something in Europe that's lacking a lot right now, but I think everywhere that's a major
Probably that's
issue.
the way to go, to trust democracy in order to have a trustable state. Because what we face here in Mexico, and in many countries in Latin America, it's a sort of lack of legitimacy.
Right.
And which is translated into distrust of the state, And the main answer is they are going to get that money for themselves, or they are going to spend it absurdly, or etc.
That's why transparency is, I think, so important.
That's one of the things.
Is private property a prerequisite for individual freedom?
Well, that's part, I think private property, in particular, the possibility to own your apartment, your business, is part of personal freedom. And in countries where you abolish this entirely, you end up with an internal passport system in order to decide whether you can move from one city to the other. You have this still in China today. So I think, private property is part of the solution, but it's not the entire solution. I think public property is useful in some areas, including education and health and even sometimes publishing, from what I understand. And I think also there are intermediate forms of property between public and private property that still need to be invented and that still exist. There was a time after the fall of the Berlin Wall where some people believed that all human activity could be organized in a shareholder company. But, we know that this is wrong. And, even in the US, nobody has proposed to transform Harvard University into a shareholder company on the stock market. It's a non-profit foundation. It's certainly not perfect, but, it's something different from pure private and pure public property. In the media today, people are talking a lot about developing, new forms of, participatory financing and participatory governance. And, I think all these new forms of property with a more democratic division of power are important and are yet to be invented. So it's not because the complete abolition of private property in the 20th century was a huge disaster, then these debates are over. And we still have to debate about different ways to organize a property relationship and the power relationship that come with them.
To misparaphrase James Carville, it's the politics stupid, you would seem to argue. But the problem, it would seem, is one, that the politicians are getting richer and richer themselves. I know the data for the UK and for the US, and the average wealth of a member of the House of Representatives and the average wealth of a member of the Senate is going up and up and up. And they're probably now within the 0.1%. Also in the UK, they're getting richer and richer. So it would seem that that might be an obstacle to using democracy to change these things. The other issue is that 1% and that the 0.1% have used democracy to push for policies in their favor. And not only that, the courts as well. So it's unclear. It's not as if they're fighting democracy and democracy wants to change that. It is that you're using democracy quite successfully in their favor. So how would you go about reinventing democracy to try and solve that issue?
Well, I think the answer is different in different countries and in different sectors of activities. The forms of properties that need to be developed are not the same, in the media, in manufacturing, in education. And regarding the political institutions themselves, I think sometimes better laws for the financing of political parties, are part of the solution. And I think that's part of the reason why, the increase in the average wealth of politicians has been much less dramatic by and large in European countries and in the US. And, sometimes, peaceful legislation building is not enough. And the history of inequality and taxation and that I tell in my book is also full of political shocks. And sometimes wars and revolution and various shocks play a very large role. And it will be surprising if it is not the same in the future. So, of course, I want to believe in, peaceful democratic discussion and evolution, but, history always invents its own pathways, and whether, what happens in, Hong Kong recently, is part of the response that can sometimes bring change, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work, and, maybe in Hong Kong it's not going to work, but in some other countries, mass mobilization and new forms of popular movement, can make a difference. In Western European countries, without the huge shocks brought by World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, and by the Bolshevik Revolution, probably the elite would have never accepted the kind of social and fiscal institution which they finally accepted after 1945, but which they refused until 1914, in particular in my country, in France, where the income tax was created not to pay for schools, but to pay for the war, to go to war with Germany. And so this is a very sad history, but this is part of our common history, and we should be careful I think we can do better in the future, but sometimes it takes very large shocks to deliver the proper institutional change and political response.
Last question.
Last
please.
question.
Last question.
Okay.
Last question. Last
You
question.
economists, you are humans, and humans have gods.
No. That's a heroic
Humans have gods. The god of economists in the 90s was competitivity. Today, productivity is God. Explain all. Or all wages. If we have in Mexico, for example, low wages, it's because of productivity, a low productivity. But you criticize the use of this notion linked to wages, to salaries. So I'd like you to share with us your vision about productivity, because Mexico have a big problem, low wages, and maybe this is the first explanation because of why we are very unequal.
Well, the formation of wages always involves more than productivity. Productivity, technological forces are important, but the formation of wages also involves social compromise, social institution. First and foremost, because of the very notion of marginal productivity, which economists like and cherish, is not always as objective as what they pretend. So it's not always written on your face what your productivity is, and sometimes some people put a lot of bargaining power in order to try to pretend that their productivity is a lot higher than what it is. So these social forces and institutions are important. Markets are embedded into a social institution, a broader social framework, and cognitive conflict about different discourse on how this is working is always part of the market economy itself. So I think we should not have too much of a sort of naturalist view of the market process.
Darwinian?
We should be very careful of this discourse, which are often just ways to justify existing inequality. So we need to demystify economics a lot, and that's part of what
Are you putting this into practice in the new school, in the new Paris School of Economics? Because I remember reading you and listening to you. Lord Skidelsky said some years ago that we had to assume that ours was a shamed subject. And I wonder if our profession has not become a dangerous profession.
Oh, I think it has become a very dangerous profession indeed. I think I view myself more as a social scientist than as an economist. I think the frontiers between economics and history, sociology, anthropology are not so clear. So economists try sometimes to pretend that they have a science that is so sophisticated that the rest of the world cannot understand it, but of course this is a big joke, and this is a very dangerous joke. But I think the rest of the people, should not let them do that, and so everybody is responsible. And I think historians, sociologists, and normal citizens should not let economists do that, and they should take economic issues for themselves and make their own mind.
Better a fox than a
It's
hedgehog.
okay. We have to, because if people is arriving, you have a lot of noise. We have come to the end of this encounter with the conviction that amid the global and domestic spheres saturated by mere opinions, I think that the in-depth conversations have sought to contrast with the strong data and very strong argumentations that have displayed you all ever. Thank you very much indeed. My heartfelt thanks to Thomas for his inspiring answers, who have added, I think, many new aspects about the social inequality. And thanks for making room for this conversation out of your very strong agenda. By the way, you have includes your presentations here in the fair, as well as in four universities, and one press conference, a number of interviews, and one meeting in the Senate, I think. All of these events in on 2 or 3 days, I think. Thanks to Ricardo, thanks to Javier, thanks to Rolando, thanks to Pascal for their insightful questions and comments. And thank you all for attending these in-depth conversations. Gracias a todos ustedes por habernos acompañado.
Thanks a lot.